Do you believe some places that have experienced a large amount of deaths can be haunted? Let's look at one such place called Waverly Hills Sanatorium. During the 1800s and early 1900s, America was devastated by a deadly disease known as the White Death or tuberculosis. This horrible and extremely contagious disease, for which no cure existed, claimed, sometimes, the entire family and sometimes an entire town. Since Louisville, Kentucky was built on top of a swampland, its entire area was a breeding ground for tuberculosis. In 1900, it had the highest death rate in America, so a hospital was constructed on a hill in southern Jefferson County in attempts to fight this deadly disease. This terrible disease continued to spread and kill, so eventually donations of funds and land were given, so the hospital was finally started in 1924. In 1926, the brand new hospital was opened and known as Waverly Hills. It was considered America's most advanced tuberculosis sanatorium. However, most patients still passed away from the deadly disease. Medication for this disease had not been invented yet, so many patients were given fresh air, plenty of rest, and nutritious food. The hospital was meant to isolate those with the disease and keep them from infecting others. Many times families and children were separated to keep infected ones away from those who had not came into contact with the infected. Treatments for tuberculosis were sometimes as deadly as the disease itself. Some of the experiments that were carried out in search of a cure seemed cruel. Patients' lungs were put under ultraviolet light in attempts to stop the spread of bacteria. This was done in so-called sun rooms, using artificial light in place of actual sunlight, or on the roof or open areas of the hospital. Since fresh air was speculated to also be a possible cure, patients were often placed in front of porches or right in front of open windows, no matter what the temperature outside. Actual photographs from this time period show patients in chairs, taking in the fresh air, with snow outside and sometimes even on the patient. Other treatments were more invasive, and bloodier. Balloons would be surgically placed in the lungs and then filled with air to expand them. This often had disastrous results. Other treatments were just as dangerous, such as an operation where muscles and ribs were removed from a patient's chest to allow the lungs to expand further and let in more oxygen. This procedure was seen as a last resort, and it's understandable that most patients did not live through this. More died than survived. The unlucky ones left through what otherwise was known as the body chute. It was an enclosed tunnel for the dead led from the hospital to the railroad tracks at the bottom of the hill. Using a motorized cable system that lowered the dead bodies in secret to the waiting trains. This was done in secret to keep patients from losing hope. Doctors believed the patient's mental health was just as important as their physical health. Waverly Hills closed down in 1960 but was reopened a year later as Woodhaven Geriatrics Sanatorium. It's reported that patient mistreatment and unusual experiments happened during the years that the building was used an old folks' home. Electroshock therapy was widely used for a variety of ailments. Huge cuts in the budget in the 60s and 70s led to both patients being treated poorly and terrible conditions. By 1982 the state forced it to shut down for good. Given all of the death, abuse and pain, it makes sense that Waverly Hills is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the country. The property over the years changed owners a few times, and by 2001 it was time-worn and nearly destroyed. It is now truly a haunted house. The hospital soon gained quite a reputation for being haunted, and story after story began to circulate of ghosts residing inside. One such story is of a little girl who was seen running up and down the third-floor solarium. Another is a little boy who was believed to have died from tuberculosis. He's always seen playing with a leather ball. Many hear eerie sounds echoing throughout the hospital. Several spectators have also seen a haunted hearse that pulls into the back and drops off coffins. Another nurse who worked in the same room, in 1942, jumped from the patio and fell several stories to her death. No one seems to know why she would have done this, but many have speculated that she may have actually have been pushed. Now I'm going to read you something from an anonymous visitor of Waverly Hills. The first time that I visited the hospital was in September 2002. I was in town for a convention and a friend of mine, who had been working with the owners at Waverly Hills, offered to take me to see the place that I had been hearing a lot about. At that point, the old hospital had been open for tours but had not reached the level of infamy that it has today. There had been no television shows, books or websites dedicated to it in those days. It was literally a dark and stormy night when we arrived at the hospital, and it had been raining all day. I was looking forward to seeing the place, no matter what the weather, and not because I was convinced that I would meet one of the former patients face to face. It was simply to experience the place for myself. By this time, I had traveled all over the country and had been to hundreds of places that were alleged to be haunted. I had felt just this same way before exploring all of them, so Waverly Hills was no different. To me, it was just an old, spooky building with a fascinating history. The fact that it was alleged to be haunted simply added to the experience. I had long since abandoned the idea of expecting too much. The only floor that we skipped over was the fourth, but my friend explained that this was the only floor in the building for which the entrance was kept locked and he had saved it for last. When we finally arrived on the fourth floor, I got the distinct feeling that something strange was in the air. I make absolutely no claims of any psychic ability whatsoever, but there was just something about this floor of the hospital that felt different than any of the others. What had been nothing more than just an old ramshackle and broken down building suddenly seemed different. I can't really put into words what felt so strange about it, but it almost seemed to be a tangible presence that I had not encountered anywhere else in the place. And right away, eerie things started to happen. We had entered the floor, in what I believe was the center of the building. Behind us was a wing that I was told was not safe to enter. Sections of the floor had fallen in, and this area was off limits to tours and visitors. The strange thing about it was that both of us clearly heard the sounds of doors slamming from this part of the building. I can assure the reader that it was not the wind either. The wind was not strong enough that night to have moved those heavy doors, and this clearly sounded as though someone was closing them very hard. When I questioned my friend about who else could be up there with us, he explained to me about how unsafe the floors were in that section. I investigated on my own, and determined that he was correct. There was no one walking around on that part of the fourth floor. I switched off my flashlight, and we walked down the corridor using only the dim, ambient light from outside. The hallway runs through the center of the building, and on either side of it are former patient rooms. Beyond the rooms is the porch area that opens to the outside. It was there, where the patients were placed to take in the fresh air. There was no glass ever placed in the huge outer windows, which has left the interior of the floor open to the elements ever since. On this night, the windows also illuminated the corridor, thanks to the low-hanging clouds that glowed with the lights of Louisville. We walked down through the dark and murky corridor, and I began to see shadows that flickered back and forth. I was sure that this was trick of the eye, though, likely caused by the lights or the wind moving something outside. But was where the corridor angled to the right that I got a look at something that was definitely not a trick of the eye. We took a few more steps, and then, without warning, the clear and distinct silhouette of a man crossed the lighted doorway, passed into the hall, and then vanished into a room on the other side of the corridor. I got a distinct look at the figure, and I know that it was a man, and that he was wearing what appeared to be a long, white drape that could have been a doctor's coat. The sighting only lasted a few seconds, but I knew what I had seen. And for some reason, it shocked and startled me so badly that I let out a yell, and grabbed a hold of my friend's jacket. I am not sure why it affected me in that way, but perhaps it was the setting, the figure's sudden appearance, my own anxiety, or likely all of these things. Regardless, after my yell, I demanded that he turn on a light, and help me to examine the room the man had vanished into. After my initial fright, I became convinced that someone else was on the floor with us. My friend assured me we were the only ones there, but he did help me search for the intruder, in an empty room with only one way in or out. There was no one there? Whoever that figure had been, he had utterly and completely vanished. I doubt that I was the first person to see this mysterious apparition on the 4th floor, and it's unlikely that I will be the last. However, this sighting put Waverly Hills into a unique category for me in that I will firmly state that I believe it is haunted. Usually, for me to do that, I must have my own unexplainable experience that goes beyond a mere bump in the night or spooky photograph. In this case, I had actually seen a ghost, and at the time, I could count the ghost sightings that I had had on 2 fingers. Waverly Hills is haunted, and for me, seeing was believing. That concludes this anonymous individual's report on what happened to them at Waverly Hills. With such a dark and disturbing history, it's no surprise that Waverly Hills has some dark forces within its dilapidated walls. I don't know about you, but I think I will stay far away from this creepy place. Have you ever been to Waverly Hills? What was your experience?